Thank you so much. I feel, I don't know, between the music and the other folks sharing their thoughts, mine's a little more technical, kind of earth-based and Terra. So I'm thrilled to be here today with so many familiar people. Obviously, when I first heard the theme Terra for the year, I kind of had to think about how I might add something to this discussion about the Earth in a very literal sense. That was my first thought. I'm a pretty literal guy. And I thought, how could I, as a dad, as a husband, as an ER doc, talk just something about the earth? And then, metaphorically speaking, my wife and other friends said, well, what about the idea of being grounded? That's something you could talk about. But I think about my typical day or my typical week as a dad with 3 kids and 2 working parents, and I don't know that I can ever claim to be an expert on being grounded. Just kind of hanging on for dear life here. And then I had to reflect a little bit because Leslie in our email said, you could just talk about what you've been up to, or talk about what your life's been doing the last few months, or where you see things going. And the reality is, the only reason that someone might ask me to come and speak about any kind of topic really is because of what I had done for the last couple of years of my life. Got into this crazy idea of running for Congress. But the idea of just sitting here talking about that or what I've been up to or what I want to do kind of feels like a little bit of old news, and I feel like I've maybe worn out that story of my life at this point. We can talk a little bit about, in the talk here, about the ideas and issue of water, about some things happening now and things maybe I plan on doing and that we can possibly do. And I chose water as a topic purely because of its connection, obviously, to the earth and to this part of West Michigan. Water is 71% of the Earth's surface, 60% of the human body. Obviously, in Michigan, our connection is pretty strong. We have 21% of the world's surface fresh water surrounding our state, and 84% of North America's fresh water. It's a huge reason why Diana and I came back to Michigan in 2001 after we finished our residency, because of our connection to West Michigan, to Lake Michigan, and to the Great Lakes. The issues surrounding water have been coming up in Michigan, obviously, for years. And we're going to get into a little bit about the Clean Water Act back in the late 60s and 70s, and then kind of flashing forward to where we are now. We've had a lot of conversations. I chose one of those readings by Dr. Mona about the Flint water crisis because it's obviously been such a huge issue statewide, regionally, and nationally, talking about the issue of water, but just the idea of how politics and kind of our water infrastructure and health really intersect and play out in people's lives, especially communities like the folks in Flint who are somewhat at risk. We've been talking about a lot politically the idea of the Enbridge Line 5 up in the Mackinac Straits. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have on their own been activists around that issue. I myself, during the campaign, talked about it. I canvassed before I was a candidate in Holland and in Grand Haven with businesses talking about the potential effects. And more recently and more locally, the issue of PFAS has come up, both in the water in Kent County and Rockford, down in Parchment, south of here, but then more recently in Robinson Elementary School right here in Ottawa County, and even in the Grand Haven water supply that a lot of you probably use, and I live in Spring Lake in our water supply. So I'm definitely not an expert in any of this. I would not claim to be. And probably people in this room, and hopefully in the talkback we can get into it, have more knowledge and more of a background in some of these issues. But what I will claim is that I probably have become a bit of an expert on how to talk about contentious issues in large and small groups. I kind of learned by baptism by fire how to do that over the last couple of years. However, judging by the fact that 168,000 people voted for the other guy, maybe I and all of us have a lot of work to do in that realm. I was a biology major in college. I didn't know right away I wanted to go into medicine, but I knew I loved science, the scientific method, data. But then I got into medicine, and really in my everyday life in medicine, even though I don't always think of it that way, science and data and evidence drives decisions that are made. A lot of us in our daily lives do that. A lot of us, and I found out in the small group talk, use science and data and evidence to drive how we think about the world, how we think about issues, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't use that as their driving force. Given all of these examples that we talked about and the recent death of Congressman John Dingell, who was an environmental advocate, I decided eventually that the idea of water was the perfect topic to talk about, connecting the idea of terra, or the earth, with politics, of which I've been deeply entrenched in the last couple of years. And something I think we can get to at the talkback, and I'm going to talk about with each of these cases, and we talked about, is the idea of truth. And how tribalism and partisanships, unfortunately, has overtaken the idea of truth when looking at all of these issues. And when we look at the evolution of water protection in this country and in the state, how unfortunately tribalism and hyperpartisanship has taken over those discussions. So if we go back in this country, in our federal government, and how we eventually decided that we would have federal law dictating our clean water, or trying to protect our water. We go all the way back to 1956, and in doing my research, I didn't know this. I think this is a really interesting piece. Hopefully you agree. It has its roots, the Clean Water Act of 1972 had its roots in 1956. There was a Minnesota Democrat named John Blatnick as chairman of the House Public Works Committee's Rivers and Harbors Subcommittee. And he was on a cruise down the Mississippi River, not to look at clean water, to think about water. He was there to assess its locks, its dams, and its levees. And he had a revelation. He was struck by the filth that he saw in the river. He said it had become a cesspool, and he came back to Washington determined to do something about it. Now that was pollution he could see, foam and debris, things floating on the river. Out of that came the bipartisan Federal Pollution Control Act of 1956, bipartisan in nature, signed by a Republican president, President Eisenhower. But as they started to look more into the idea of keeping our water clean, they realized from the Public Health Service that wastewater treatment was a major issue and that it had significant health impacts. So a new bill was drafted. They tried to get more through. Eisenhower rejected it. It was passed in a bipartisan way, but Eisenhower vetoed it. He thought, and this is something that has come up time and again, that water pollution is a uniquely local issue. Now, I think we could argue that the Mississippi River starts in Minnesota, empties out down in Louisiana, it goes through quite a few states through the middle of our country. Seems to be that we probably need more of a national response to that. And Kennedy actually, part of what he ran on in 1960 was the idea that he wanted to strengthen our protections of waters in a federal sense. And in 1961, in his inaugural address, he talked about this, and Congress got him a bill. In 1961, he actually signed more strict health-connected legislation for clean water. Through the 1960s, a lot of our water protection, a lot of the federal response to water protection was kind of piecemeal. And again, a lot of it was done by the states with federal support monetarily, but there wasn't an overarching federal system or architecture to protect the water. And like a lot of things, and again, we talked about this in the small group, how stories and individual moments probably have more of an impact on changing the psyche of our huge population than overarching arguments and themes. And this happened, some of you here may remember this, I don't, it happened before I was born, in 1969, June 22nd. Now we know, looking back, that rivers had, just like the Mississippi did in '56, overt signs of pollution. The Potomac River coming out of our nation's capital had a stench and foam flowing through it. People joked about the East River in New York, that people don't drown in it. If you fall in, you simply decay. And so, these were local truths that people knew and they talked about, but it was the Cuyahoga River, and people might remember on June 22nd, 1969, that oil-soaked debris actually caught the Cuyahoga River on fire. And if you look at images of this, it's incredible. I mean, it's just a river engulfed in flames. It only lasted a couple of hours, but to the extent it could in 1969, those images went viral. Not like today with a tweet, but papers picked up and it's spreading out from Cleveland all around. And over the next year and a half, from mid-June of '69, Congress had hearings and collected documentation about what they could do to reduce pollution. There's always been this battle between environmentalism and industry, and actually it was industry coming on board for a federal solution that really pushed this farther down the way. A lot of industries, when it was state by state, simply said, well, we could move to a different state. They realized, well, that's not fair. If we're in an industry that can't move from state to state, maybe it'd be better if we just had a federal standard, we all had to abide by it, and then we'd all be playing in a level playing field. The important piece of this is 1971-72, is that this, again, was a bipartisan solution. We had the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate voting on this set of rules that eventually became known as the Clean Water Act. There were differences of opinion, of course, but really what happened, and I've heard this long-held adage, and it came true certainly during this discussion. When Democrats and Republicans talk to new members of Congress, they talk about the opposition being the opposite party, but the enemy is the other chamber. So between the House and the Senate, they had some disagreements. The House wanted this to be more state control with federal funding. The Senate wanted a heavy-handed, more federal response, and they kind of knocked it out over 10 months of conference committee, and they got a bill to Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon, in some people's minds, is credited with being a champion of the environment because he supposedly, signed the Clean Water Act. And I guess I didn't realize this explicitly, but he vetoed the Clean Water Act. He vetoed it in a time when he thought Congress was going to be out of session, so they wouldn't be able to hold a vote to override the veto, and he thought it could stand. Not because he disagreed with what they wanted to do, but he said the $24 billion price tag was just too much. Luckily, our Senate and our House, enough people stayed in D.C. that within 2 hours after his veto, the Senate had an override, 52-12. So only 64 people voted, but they had a quorum, 52-12, including 9 Republicans, voted to override the veto. The House followed 12 hours later, 247-23. Can you think of anything besides a new post office or, something to honor the late John Dingell passing with that kind of majority? And 83 Republicans joined Democrats in overriding the veto of Nixon. So that's how we got the Clean Water Act. Nixon still used some shenanigans, something called impoundment, where he withheld about half the money going towards that $24 billion, and it wasn't until 1975 in the courts that eventually it was settled that the president can't unilaterally take the purse strings away from Congress. And it struck me last night as I was going through this, how does this connect to right now, right? So there may be some it was Train versus the City of New York, so maybe look out for that as we hear some legal arguments coming forth about the new emergency declaration. The courts have sided with Congress that the Constitution gives them the power of the purse. And so I guess we'll see how that plays out in a non-water related issue that we're dealing with right now. So importantly, this was the first major federal regulation, federal set of laws that address not just what you could see on the surface, not just sort of solid waste and the effluent going into the waters, but overall quality of waters. It ushered in an era where they actually regulated various toxins, and this idea comes full circle right now in our state with lead and flint that you can't see, with PFAS, that still we don't know exactly what it might do, but we know what it has the potential to do and the harm it has the potential to do. Let's talk a little bit about that in a little bit. To me, I guess we can flash forward about the Clean Water Act to an issue that's right now become very partisan within the Clean Water Act. How many people have heard of WOTUS, Waters of the United States? I hadn't heard that acronym or hadn't registered it, and during the Grand Haven debate in October of last year, Heisinger asked me, have you heard of WOTUS? And I kind of had to say no. But WOTUS is an acronym, and basically in 2015, the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers published the Clean Water Rule, or WOTUS, Waters of the United States. And they wanted to define what water could be regulated under the Clean Water Act. So, from 72 to 2015, 43 years later, trying to figure out, okay, what exactly can we regulate? Seems pretty clear, like Michigan, the Mississippi River, the Grand River, these navigable waters. Unfortunately, this is a case where the Clean Water Act now has become a partisan piñata for mostly conservative talk radio, but unfortunately, our elected officials have kind of gotten on board. Huizinga did bring that up, and he's parroted the often used line that we could regulate puddles and ditches. And well, it's true. If you look at the EPA website, and I went on there last night looking at diagrams, they show these diagrams as very scientific of navigable waterways and then 100-year floodplains adjacent to them. And there are some temporary bodies of water that come and go with the seasons that most of us would argue we don't want people dumping waste into these, quote, puddles or ditches because they could get into our water supply. But in fact, again, this is where I think, unfortunately, we've come in 40-some years to make something as simple as clean water that most people can agree with and get on board with a partisan issue. Unfortunately, a lot of what I want to say here are questions that I don't know that have answers. We talked about it earlier. Hopefully, people want to stay for talk back. But the question is, why is it so partisan? Why is there an aversion to objectivity? Why have an aversion to data or to science? What does that do? If you look at Michigan in the past, one of our most environment-friendly and water-friendly governors was Governor Milliken, a Republican. This wasn't a partisan issue back then. He was instrumental, and again, this is something I didn't know. Maybe people who are around or know the history of the bottle deposit law in Michigan. Milliken called for it in his State of the State in 1971. And they couldn't get it through. And eventually in 1978, he pushed for a ballot initiative. And he was the first Michigander to sign the ballot initiative, put his name down as governor, and it passed overwhelmingly. He also helped regulate phosphorus in the waters in Michigan. Lake Erie was a dead lake. I remember that. I remember Lake Erie being a dead lake. I grew up on the east side of the state. All of the lower Great Lakes, while maybe not dead lakes, had very strong limits on the amount people could bathe in them. Our no swim advisories were, fairly significant. And Milliken led the charge as governor to eliminate phosphorus. There was significant resistance, and the local company here, Amway, was a big driver of that resistance. They had very high phosphorus detergents. They didn't want those regulations. It was going to cost them money. And they actually had an Amway official as a member of the Water Resources Board. So our governor back then just transferred the authority to a different department and then got it through. Again, to me, nonpartisan. This was a Republican governor who was very popular, got reelected and reelected and reelected, pushing back against industry, just for the sake of keeping our water clean. If we come to the present, there's three big issues, I think, that are affecting water in Michigan that we talk about both politically and environmentally. One is Line 5, Enbridge Line 5. Most people here know about it, probably have, a lot of you know a lot more about it than me. But for the past 5.5 to 6 years, there have been growing concern. It's a 3.5-mile stretch of the Straits of Mackinac. There are two 20-inch pipelines that transport 23 million gallons of oil a day through there. This is a pipeline that was completed in 1953, and when they completed it, they said it should have a lifespan of about 50 years. So we're now 66 years from its original being laid down, and we're still arguing over the life of Enbridge Line 5. The biggest concern is if a spill or a leak happened in the Straits of Mackinac, it's could be one of the most damaging of any oil leak in any fresh waters in the United States simply because of its location. Enbridge has a history. A lot of you remember back in 2010, Enbridge had Line 6B down in Talmadge Creek that was a tributary of the Kalamazoo River. Over 1 million gallons of oil leaked from Line 6B before anyone even knew about it in about 17 hours. Currently, Line 5, it stretches all the way from northern Wisconsin through the UP, through the lower part, then over into Sarnia and into Ontario. It's a Canadian pipeline, Canadian oil. We're moving it through our state. They've already had 1.1 million gallons of oil leak in 29 incidents since 1968. This is fairly recent data found out by FOIA requests. And actually in a study just about a year and a half ago, independent scientists, actually probably tilted more towards industry, hired by Enbridge, determined there was about a 2% risk of a leak by 2053. Now again, for me and my science brain, 2% risk is pretty high, 1 in 50 chance of a major devastating oil leak in our fresh water that would potentially affect, I think they said, about a $6 billion recovery effort to clean it up, and how many hundreds of thousands of jobs and fisheries and such that would be affected. And so, this became a huge issue in the most recent election. I think it was a big part of why Dana Nessel probably won the primary for the Democrats for the Attorney General, because she was very strongly calling for the shutdown of Line 5, and Gretchen Whitmer and Abdul El Sayed, the two frontrunners for the Democrats, called for it. And so we had our election in early November, and the majority of Michiganders seemed to side with the idea that, in fact, we should shut down or have serious discussions about doing something different, replacing their ability to move oil through the Straits of Mackinac. And in the lame duck session of November of 2018, the Michigan legislature passed a bill to create a tunnel under the Straits and to keep Line 5 in place. We can have our ideas about what that means. The problem is this is going to be held up in court. Line 5 is going to be running the way it is for at least the next 5 to 10 years before anything different is done about it. Again, this became a partisan issue. A lame duck Michigan legislature, 100% Republicans and voted for it, 100% Democrats voted against it, decided we're going to build a tunnel and we're going to keep Line 5 in place, even though the will of the people seemed to suggest that people were against this. So why is it a partisan issue? Why does this happen? I talked a bit in the beginning about tribalism. I think in some ways, politicians, they're just trying to win elections, it would seem, and do some good along the way, hopefully. But I think they kind of tap into the idea of tribalism, where people say, well, you're my side, you're the ones I vote for, so we're just going to support you no matter what. But what is the effect? What is the damage that can happen from there? What is the cost, both economic, politically? What is the social cost of having partisan decisions about such important issues? The same thing can be said of lead and flint. And at the end of the lead piece, we can talk about what I think the main reason why the lead issue is totally a partisan issue and totally political issue. Basically, it was based upon, and I think a lot of you know Mona Atisha, I've heard her before. She was a pediatrician in Flint who exposed that they had levels of lead in children in Flint that were 2 to 3 times normal. And it all stemmed around the changing of the water supply for the citizens of Flint. 100,000 residents of Flint, Governor Snyder appointed an emergency manager, and to save money, they were going to switch from the Detroit River to the KWA, a different water supply out of Lake Huron. In the interim, for about 10 to 12 months, they switched to take water from the Flint River, and they were treating it themselves. When they did this, they found how levels of coliform bacteria, they had to add more chlorine. Eventually, they got the chlorine levels to the point of toxicity where they were leaching lead out of old service lines, and entire neighborhoods were having massive amounts of lead in their water. People complained about it initially. They were ignored. This was back in April of 2014. It wasn't until September of 2015 that Dr. Mona Atisha and others sounded the alarm. And eventually by October 15, Governor Snyder authorized $9 million to switch back to Detroit water. And I think we've all seen what has unfolded since then. Now we have numerous lawsuits, how many millions of dollars have been spent defending people in our government. And the question then is, well, why did it happen? Was it really just a political thing? I mean, the emergency manager is a nonpartisan individual, and they were just trying to save money. And I think some of the defenders of that decision was, well, they had a $23 million budget deficit. They needed to save money. But the very presence of an emergency manager was a hyper-partisan issue. Back in 2012, there was, I think the emergency manager law initially was from 2004. In 2012, there was a ballot initiative. 60-some% of people in Michigan said, we don't want the emergency manager. We think that is government overreach. And again, in a lame duck Republican legislature, the governor, the Senate, and the House overturned the will of the people, and they reinstated the emergency manager law, which led to eventually having an emergency manager in Flint making a very one-sided decision about money, putting that over the actual health implications for people. And people just basically let it happen. That was 2012. Well, there was an election 2 years later in 2014. These politicians who did this weren't punished. They were allowed to just continue winning their election next cycle after next cycle. I think, again, the idea of tribalism and how that impacts people's response. They may see a few headlines, a few news reports about what happened, but for them to draw all these connections, it takes a little bit of time, a little bit of thought. It's a lot easier just to kind of sit back and say, well, these are my side, these are my team. It happens on both sides. I said before, and I said it this morning, I wasn't a Democrat till I decided to run as a Democrat for Congress. Certainly all of my values aligned with a lot of the values of that party, but I tried to just be who I was and have those values. But I'm sure I'm even more so now guilty of picking my side in a discussion. If I see headlines, I'm going to believe the headline that more aligns with the folks that I agree with. But in these cases, we see time after time, and now we're seeing it play out with PFAS. This one hits a lot closer to home for a lot of us. So PFAS are perfluoroalkyl substances, and they're basically silent forever chemicals that have cropped up in our water systems that we've now been seeing since 2016. The EPA set a safe limit of 70 parts per trillion in 2016. However, last year, early 2018, there was an EPA study that originally was blocked, but eventually I think Politico first got the leaked emails and then it became public, that the EPA in their study suggested probably 12 parts per trillion would be a safer level. We now flash forward to 2019, and they just last week released the details of their PFAS plan, and they said they're going to take until the end of 2019 to actually set those safe standards and to do anything about it. So we're still sitting on this number, 70 parts per trillion. Senator Winnie Brinks in Grand Rapids, who a lot of you know, she proposed legislation to set it at 5 parts per trillion. The truth is somewhere in between, and we talked a little about what is truth, and probably what is, quote, safe is somewhere in between there. When the EPA is blocking a study from being released, and it's a partisan, would appear to be partisan EPA, that 12 is probably a pretty decent number. In our water supply, it was released in August of 2018. Trying to remember the name of the Northwest Ottawa water supply, that we had a combined total of 20 parts per trillion in the municipal water supply, and we're told because 70 is that threshold number. Again, we don't know exactly what's, quote, safe, but I know for my family, we installed a whole house filtration system that will get rid of PFAS, because we're looking at our 3 kids, and 2 of them are girls, and the idea of possibly having issues with infertility, increased risk of cancer, that's too much. Now, the folks who push back against the government overreach and regulation, particularly folks who have the resources, they can put a filter in their house, and they don't have to worry about it anymore. But what about the people in Flint? What about the people in Grand Haven? What about the kids at Robinson Elementary School? Robinson Elementary School, that came out in October, 144 parts per trillion, because it was in their well. I don't know how many people might have gone. They had recently had down at the Fillmore Complex, the Ottawa County offices, sort of a town hall to talk about what they're going to do. For now, it's bottled water and filters, trying to figure out what they can do to actually clean this up. And so, as we look at the EPA's announcement this past week about their plans at the end of 2019, this again becomes a partisan thing. And I'm guilty, like I said, as much as anyone else. We had Democratic Congressman Dan Kildee express frustration, and he and Senator Gary Peters have announced that they would like to have Congress step in and force the EPA to set a higher standard. Our own Congressman Bill Huizenga praised the EPA and said that politicians should stay out of it and let scientists and health officials set the standards on their own timeline. I guess I don't understand how there can be maybe neither of them are right and it's somewhere in the middle, but to have such absolutely differing points of view from reasonably intelligent people who are serving in the same capacity in government, to me it reeks of partisanship and not truly putting the interests of people at play. And so this gets to an issue coming forward, and I can get a little bit into what I'm doing next, and actually have a meeting on Friday to deal with this issue. Maybe a show of hands, how many people have heard about the ideas to dredge the Grand River from Granville to Eastmanville? So you've seen it. I think the Grand Haven Tribune has written about it a few times. It's popped up on a few news stories. It's currently an idea mostly driven by a guy named Dan Hibma. If you've ever seen the Granville Castle apartment complex, it was intended to look like Cinderella's castle. It looks like a prison. It's an eyesore. It's, I think, only about 20% occupied right now. But it's in Granville. And that's where this guy, Dan Hibma happens to be the husband of former Secretary of State Republican Terry Lynn Land. Okay, so there's a connection there. Dan Hibma has been very vocal about his desire to open a marina somewhat adjacent to the castle. Now, Leslie brought up that there isn't really right on the river, so we wonder what kind of work they're going to do to get that. But he's expressed interest. There's actually a Facebook page, Grand River Waterways, and a website. I went on and followed the page last night, and something we want to keep an eye on. Dan Hibma, we believe, or at least Grand River Waterways, lobbied our state legislature in the most recent lame duck, a party line vote. All Republicans, including Ottawa County, Jim Lilly, Roger Victory, voted to appropriate $2 million to do a study, to do core samples on along that stretch of river to see about the feasibility of dredging. $2 million. In the same month, we found out that Michigan had the lowest increase of education funding from 2002 to 2015. We found out we're at the very bottom of overall education funding. And we're being told that it's just too expensive. We can't afford to put more money into schools. Somehow $2 million found its way into a pet project of the husband of a former Republican Secretary of State that will have zero benefit to the people of Ottawa County. And my concern, and the reason this comes up in the setting of PFAS, is this. Grand Haven water supply gets its water from Lake Michigan. It's about 800 to 1,000 feet out from the mouth of the river, just south of the river. And we had PFAS levels of about 20.3 parts per trillion. Grand Rapids, Wyoming, and other communities get their water from Lake Michigan, just south of the Grand River, where it empties, but about another 500 to 1,000 feet out into the lake. And it's been very, people who are in that business, Joseph Vanderstel, he's a water facilities manager at Northwest Ottawa System, said the river's probably the source. And the fact that Grand Haven's drawing from closer to the river is probably why our levels are higher than the others. Now, he still maintains that 70 parts per trillion is the dangerous level, so 20 is no big deal. What happens when we stir up sediment upstream a stretch of river from Granville all the way to Eastmanville? What happens to PFAS or any number of chemicals that we don't even know about yet, that we don't know their health effects? They're going to draw these little core samples of the sediment to kind of see what's in there and see what might happen. But how do we know what those levels of PFAS will be 1,000 feet out into Lake Michigan after they stir all this up? Again, it's a concern to me. It seems to be a very partisan issue in that it was 100% Republicans in our state legislature who voted to appropriate this money, and 100% of the Democrats voted not to appropriate this money. So myself, and I won't take credit for leading this, a friend of mine, Jeff Seaver in Allendale, who helped with the campaign, and others are meeting this Friday at WEMEAC office in Grand Rapids with folks from League of Conservation Voters, WEMEAC, hopefully DEQ, to talk about what we can do to kind of put the skids on this. I talked to Governor Whitmer a couple weeks ago at an event, put the bug in her ear, going to talk to her West Michigan representative to try to at least slow this down so we can know what we're getting into before we have these unintended consequences of PFAS and other chemicals in our water supply right here in Grand Haven because some person in Granville wants to develop a marina and try to make a buck, putting our lives at risk. So I guess to wrap it up, a common theme, both from the rejection of the Clean Water Rule in WOTUS, Enbridge Line 5, lead in Flint, PFAS across Michigan, to me is a role that partisanship and tribalism on either side play in the rejection of science and the support of industry and the politicians that blindly support those industries. It seems that the word environmentalist has become a dirty word, certainly on conservative talk radio. I listen to Hannity once in a while, I really do. I can't watch Fox News much because we have a a la carte plan for our charter and we didn't choose Fox News, so we can't even get it. But I can get Wood Radio, and I listen once in a while. And the term environmentalist has been armed by them to push back against folks. And with some members of Congress, it's become a dirty word, environmentalist. But in addition just to demonizing folks who support the environment, this talks about water. We talk about climate change, and we talked about it earlier. It seems to be a rejection of science in general and data in decision-making in general from Congress, but filtering down into the general population. How we make our decisions, to me, should always be driven on the best available evidence of the time. What we know now is different than what we knew 50 years ago, and what we know 50 years from now will be vastly different than what we know now. But you use what you have in front of you at the moment, and that's how you should make decisions. So this rejection of science, from climate science to clean air and water to vaccines, it's having lasting effects on the environment, on our health, and on really the future of our people. I was taught, like I said, as a biology major, as getting my medical degree, that data from research and science is as close to the truth as we can get. We don't know exactly what truth is, but we know what the preponderance of evidence is. And that, to me, should be our standard, particularly when dealing with issues like this, like clean water. But as truth becomes more malleable in the public sphere, we got to reclaim that idea. I think the people in this room, the people I talk to there and we'll talk to here, believe that. It's easy to talk to ourselves and talk to each other like that, but we have to continue to elect officials, but also engage with other folks in our community to bring truth and data and science back as our guiding force and reclaim that as one of the foundations of policy making and decision making in our government. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for suffering through this with me. And I hope as many people as possible stay for the talk back and we can get into some of this, maybe even get more political partisan than I wanted to be here. And again, thanks so much for what you guys are doing. I appreciate your time. Thanks.